Rain streaked down the cafe windows as a black single dad stepped inside, counting the few dollars he had left before work. Near the window, a homeless woman sat shivering, her clothes soaked, her hands pressed to her stomach as people walked past like she didn't exist. Every empty chair around her felt louder than words. Marcus noticed her the moment everyone else chose not to. When he quietly placed food in front of her, the room froze. One voice finally cut through the silence. "You don't belong here!" What no one in that cafe understood was this: that small act would follow him home weeks later in a way no one could ignore. Comment and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe if you believe stories like this should never be ignored. Marcus moved through mornings the same way every day, quiet, careful, invisible when he needed to be. Being a black single dad meant there was no room for mistakes, no cushion for bad luck. Every dollar had a job before it ever reached his pocket, and every decision circled back to one thing: his daughter. Naomi was still young enough to believe her father had answers for everything, even on days when he barely had enough for himself. That belief carried weight. It shaped how Marcus Johnson showed up in the world. The cafe was never a place of comfort, just convenience. Warm air, cheap food, and a corner where no one asked questions, as long as you didn't ask for anything either. Marcus understood those rules without anyone explaining them. He had learned early that some spaces watched him closer than others, measuring tone, posture, patience. He stayed polite. He stayed small. He stayed moving. The woman by the window didn't follow those rules because she didn't know them, or maybe because survival had erased the option to care. Emily sat curled inward, soaked from the rain, eyes fixed on nothing outside the glass. Hunger showed in the way her hands shook, in the way she avoided looking at people who had already decided she didn't belong. Emily Carter hadn't planned to be there. She had only planned to make it one more hour without falling apart. Marcus noticed more than he wanted to: the way people glanced, then looked away, the way the room tolerated her presence but refused her humanity. Naomi noticed too. Children always did. She watched her father's face change, the way it did when he saw something unfair and knew pretending not to see would cost him later. What none of them knew yet was that this moment, this ordinary morning in an unremarkable cafe, wasn't small at all. It was the beginning of something heavier, something that would follow Marcus home long after the rain dried, and force people who were comfortable staying silent to finally look straight at what they'd helped create. Days passed, then weeks, and the cafe settled into a routine that felt harmless on the surface. Marcus came in early, always before the rush, always counting change before he ordered. Naomi sat beside him, swinging her legs, watching adults with the sharp curiosity of a child who noticed patterns others ignored. Emily returned too, never on time, never predictable, always carrying the weight of someone who hadn't slept safely. She chose the same seat near the window every time, as if consistency itself were protection. Marcus never asked questions. He learned long ago that survival didn't always come with explanations. Instead, he slid food across the table when no one was looking, pretending it was extra, pretending it cost nothing. But nothing about it was free. Every meal meant something else went without. Every quiet kindness added pressure to a life already stretched thin. The cafe noticed, not loudly, not at first. It started with looks that lingered too long, with pauses that made the air feel heavy. People stopped sitting near that table. Cups clinked harder. Chairs scraped louder. Emily felt it immediately. She had learned to read rooms the way prey reads shadows. Her shoulders tightened. Her eyes stayed low. Hunger made her brave, but fear made her small. One morning, a man stood near the counter longer than necessary, watching them without pretending otherwise. His stare didn't soften when Marcus looked back. It sharpened. Emily's hands began to shake as she lifted her cup. She whispered without lifting her head, "I'm sorry, I don't want to cause trouble." The words hit Marcus harder than any insult. He had heard that apology too many times, always from people who were already paying a price. He leaned forward, voice low but firm. "You're not the problem." "Don't let them tell you that." Naomi watched everything, the tension, the silence, the way adults found excuses to look away. She leaned toward her father, confusion turning into anger. Why does everyone act like she's doing something wrong? No one answered her. That silence became a character of its own, thick, deliberate, accusing. Emily flinched as someone behind them muttered just loud enough to be heard, "This isn't a shelter." The words weren't shouted, but they landed like they were. From that day on, things escalated quickly. Emily arrived with new bruises she tried to hide beneath long sleeves. Sometimes she looked exhausted, eyes hollow, movements delayed. Sometimes she didn't show up at all, and Marcus felt the absence like a warning sign he didn't know how to read. He caught glimpses of a man outside, once well-dressed, impatient, watching through the glass before disappearing. Emily noticed him too. Her breathing changed. Her hands trembled harder than hunger could explain. Marcus began to worry about more than food. He worried about safety, about what happened after she left, about what kind of danger followed her like a shadow. He wanted to ask. He didn't. Prying had consequences too. One afternoon, the tension finally snapped into something undeniable. The same man from before stepped inside, his presence instantly shifting the room. Emily froze. Her cup rattled against the saucer. He didn't lower his voice when he spoke. "You think you can just hide her?" The cafe went silent. Naomi stood halfway out of her chair, heart racing. Marcus stood fully, placing himself between them without hesitation. His voice carried, louder than he intended, steady despite the fear climbing his spine. "Step back. You don't get to talk to her like that." The man sneered, but he left. Not defeated, delayed. And that distinction mattered. Emily didn't relax. She shook, tears spilling despite her effort to stay quiet. Marcus knew then this wasn't just poverty. It wasn't just hunger. Something worse was circling. The next morning, Emily didn't come. The chair by the window stayed empty. Marcus checked the door again and again, each minute tightening the knot in his chest. Naomi asked questions he couldn't answer. Hours passed. Days followed. No sign, no explanation. What Marcus didn't know was that his small acts had already set something irreversible in motion. Forces far larger than that cafe were shifting, closing in, preparing to collide. And when the truth finally arrived, it would not gently. It would arrive with power, and it would demand to be seen. The cafe door opened without warning. Not slowly, not politely. It swung wide, slamming against the frame hard enough to rattle the windows. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs stopped moving. Every instinct in the room leaned toward danger before anyone understood why. Two men in dark suits stepped inside first, scanning the space like they owned it. They didn't look confused. They didn't look curious. They looked precise. Behind them walked a third man, older, calm, carrying a thick folder pressed against his chest. Robert Klein didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Authority followed him like a shadow. Marcus felt it before he understood it. The shift. The same pressure he'd felt weeks ago, but heavier now, sharper. Naomi gripped his sleeve. The chair by the window was still empty, and for a split second, he thought this was about him. About the risk he'd taken without realizing how visible it had made him. Then she walked in. Emily stepped through the doorway slowly, dressed in clean clothes that still didn't quite hide the fear in her posture. Her hair was brushed back, but her hands trembled the same way they always had. The room didn't recognize her at first. Not until she lifted her eyes. Not until the silence bent around her. A man followed closely behind her, face tight with anger he hadn't bothered to contain. Daniel Whitmore moved like someone used to being obeyed. His presence sucked the air out of the space, and Emily shrank instinctively, shoulders curling inward. The words exploded before anyone could stop them. "You thought you could disappear from me?" Emily flinched. The sound hit her like a shove. Marcus stepped forward without thinking, placing himself between them, heart pounding. "Back up! You don't get to touch her!" Gasps rippled through the cafe. Phones lifted this time. No one looked away. Daniel laughed, sharp and humorless, eyes never leaving Emily. "She belongs to me! You all need to stay out of it!" Robert raised a single hand. The motion was small but final. His voice cut through the tension, louder now, unmistakable. "SIR, that ends today." The words landed like a verdict. Robert opened the folder and spoke clearly, deliberately, so there would be no confusion. Emily had been reported missing, not by friends, not by chance. By her mother, a woman whose name carried weight far beyond that cafe. Margaret Carter had been searching non-stop, and the abuse Emily endured had finally been documented, undeniable, and no longer hidden behind money or intimidation. Daniel's confidence cracked. He stepped back once, then again, eyes darting as control slipped through his fingers. Emily didn't move. She stood taller than Marcus had ever seen her stand, fear still there, but no longer alone. Her voice shook, but it was loud enough to break through everything else. I ran. Because I was scared. I stayed alive because someone treated me like a human being. Silence followed, heavy, permanent. Daniel said nothing more. He didn't need to. The power had shifted and everyone felt it. The cafe, once a place of quiet judgment, had become a witness, not to kindness, to truth. Marcus finally exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Naomi's grip loosened. The weight that had pressed on them since that first rainy morning lifted, just enough to breathe. As Robert closed the folder, the room understood something it couldn't undo. This wasn't charity. This wasn't coincidence. This was accountability arriving late, but unmistakably. And as Emily walked away from the window for the last time, one question hung in the air, refusing to settle, now that the truth had been dragged into the light. Who would still claim they never saw it coming? The cafe didn't return to normal after that day. It couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was recognition. People left in stages, not rushing, not talking, carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. Marcus gathered Naomi and headed for the door without looking back. He didn't need validation. He had already paid the cost of standing up, and he would have paid it again. Emily didn't sit by the window anymore. She stood beside Margaret, steadying herself, no longer shrinking to fit the comfort of strangers. The fear that once dictated her every move hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned her. What happened in that cafe didn't erase the past. It exposed it. And exposure was the first step toward accountability. Marcus walked home with the same responsibilities he'd carried before, same bills, same pressure, same world. But something had changed anyway, not in his circumstances, in his certainty. Naomi watched him closely that night, absorbing the lesson without needing it explained. That doing the right thing doesn't guarantee safety, applause, or reward. It guarantees truth. What unfolded wasn't a miracle. It wasn't charity. It was a reminder of how close injustice lives to everyday spaces and how often it survives because no one wants to disrupt their routine. Racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting for permission to stay comfortable. This story wasn't about a meal. It wasn't about money or power. It was about who gets protected and who is expected to endure. And the question it leaves behind isn't easy or gentle. When dignity is on the line, will you stay seated or will you stand, knowing the cost? If this story made you pause, hit like and share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop a comment with your thoughts. We read every one. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for stories that refuse to stay silent.